Okay, let's continue to look at these two YAML files, Nginx pod cluster services. So this is kind of a standard Nginx pod running two Nginx replications, and just notice the services is Nginx service, and the tab is cluster IP. Let's look at this guy, F5 resources config map. It's config map for the virtual server configuration, F5 type virtual server. So in the back end, defines the specify the cluster services, the Nginx service, virtual server port, health monitor, front end, virtual IP address, partition on the BIGIP, load balancing method. Yeah, not much here. So let's look at the how. So when we apply this to YAML to the Kubernetes, BIGIP Kubernetes, the Kubernetes BIGIP controller will retrieve the configuration from Kubernetes Kubi API server and populate it to the BIGIP. So let's look at the Kubernetes BIGIP controller pod. So this is the Kubernetes BIGIP controller pod. Let's get to a shell to the pod. Look at what's running inside the pod, the container. This is the process, Kubernetes BIGIP controller. This is a BIGIP config driver, which is a Python REST client to talk to BIGIP, REST server. And this is the configuration file. We should pay attention. This is a configuration file. Let's see what's inside this. So it's JSON file. Okay, let's have a better look at it. Yes, so this is the same config JSON file. So this file, this config.json file is the Kubernetes BIGIP controller get the configuration from the Kubernetes Kubi API server and write this config JSON file. See it as the virtual server configuration. Pools contains the pod IP. VXLAN ARP address for those pod. The FDB entry for each node. So when troubleshooting the Kubernetes BIGIP controller, to see this file is maybe important to look at, to see if the controller can get a proper configuration from the Kubernetes cluster. So you will know if problem happens on the BIGIP side or the Kubernetes cluster side. Again, Kubernetes BIGIP controller retrieves the configuration from Kubernetes cluster and write the configuration to the config.json file. This REST Python REST client get the configuration from the config.json file and write it to BIGIP. So on the BIGIP, in test partition, see this is a virtual configuration. So you can match this virtual configuration to the config.json file in the Kubernetes BIGIP controller pod. LTM pool, there's pod IP. So you can also show the FDB entry. The Flannel VXLAN FDB entry for each node. ARP entry for each pod. So one thing to be aware is that when you apply the Kubernetes BIGIP controller, right after the deployment, the daemon set deployment, this controller will write the FDB entry to the BIGIP, populate the FDB entry to the BIGIP. After you applied the config map for the virtual configuration, then the controller will write the ARP entry to the BIGIP. So there is sometimes when customer added the BIGIP fake load, and then they start to immediately do the network test to see BIGIP can reach to the pod. You can't, because you have to apply the config map and then the controller will write the ARP entry to the BIGIP. After that, you can have network connectivity between BIGIP and the cluster, the pod in the cluster. So yes, let's end this.